A man once said if you want a good story, just ask any random person if there was ever an event in their life they cannot explain. Someone almost always has one weird thing that has happened to them. So Reddit, regardless of whatever you believe about the world, what's your story? 1. My husband and I used to watch Ghost Adventures together as a way to unwind at the end of the day. One time, we were watching them do an EVP session. Zach said hello, and a very clear child's voice answered back hi. But the show didn't acknowledge it and moved on. Now, if you've ever seen the show, you know they'll latch on to anything as evidence, which made ignoring this piece strange. So we skipped back to watch the scene again. But this time, it wasn't there. It wasn't in the show. It was in our house. We've never been able to explain it. 2. While out exploring the forest behind my best friend's house, we saw his older sister standing still in a clearing 3 meters away, staring away from us. We debated if we should go talk to her because the feeling was off. We had to walk around brush to get to her, and when we lost sight of her for 2 seconds tops, the clearing was empty. I always get creeped out wondering what the front of that person looked like. 3. A couple times growing up, I saw faces peer out behind things. I could never distinguish any features though. The faces looked white and blurred out. Both times it happened was while me and my group of friends were playing different games. Once it appeared from under a blue tarp that was covering an old washing machine. The side of the tarp lifted and a face popped up and went back down when it saw me looking. And the other time I was standing in the forest waiting my turn to swing on a rope, and I saw a head looking at me from behind a rock in my peripheral. That one had a red hat and as soon as I looked it ducked down. Both times I went and looked right away and of course there was nothing around. I told my friends of course but I was the only one to see them. 4. Back in college, some friends and I were renting a house near campus. It had a walk-up attic that we were going to convert into another bedroom, but decided against because everyone felt creeped out up there. We ended up putting a heavy trunk in front of the door and wedging it in next to a large bookcase to make sure no guests accidentally opened it and went up there. One day, we came home from a party and my buddy tripped over the trunk. It was now partially sticking out from the wall. We were confused as hell, wondering who pulled the trunk away from the wall. We turned on the lights and noticed paint chips and pieces of wood all over the trunk and floor. It looked like someone had been slamming the attic door against the trunk trying to push it away so they could get out, but gave up because it was wedged in against the bookshelf. It was a shitty neighborhood, so we freaked out a bit thinking a crackhead or something had tried to break in. We gathered ourselves and found enough blunt or sharp objects to give us the confidence to check it out. We went up and there was literally nothing. No crackheads, no squatters, no windows, no chimney, no missing roof, nothing. No way for someone to get in or out. Our attic door slammed against a heavy trunk hard enough to splinter part of the wood seemingly by itself and for no reason. 5. I lost a full 3 hours of time over the course of what should have been about 30 minutes. Me and my friends were camping at a recreational area that was about 10 minutes from the nearest town. We ran out of hot dogs and buns, so we were all pretty starving. Me and 2 other friends elected to drive down to the town and back. A quick 30-minute drive that would have had us happily around the campfire in no time. We pile in, drive down, grab exactly what we need, and head back. As soon as we get to camp, we're being yelled at by our friends claiming that we were gone for 3 to 4 hours and that they would have starved to death had we not arrived. We were confused, as we had practically rushed to and from the grocery store with the supplies. Hell, the hot dogs still felt like they were just barely taken out of the fridge. Most confusing moment of our lives. 6. When I was about 13, my parents went out for the night while my sister and I stayed home. We were in our basement. Because of the way our house was set up, you could hear the garage door open from the basement. We heard the garage door open and close. We heard my parents come through the door into our kitchen, but we thought nothing of it. Then, about 5 minutes later, we heard the same chain of auditory events. My sister and I looked at each other, utterly confused. Soon after, our dad yelled down the stairs, "Hey kids, we're home." And quat. We went up and asked if they had come in 5 minutes ago and they said they hadn't. I told them what happened and all 4 of us rummaged through every room of the house because we were afraid someone was hiding somewhere. We never found anything or anyone. If it had been just me, I might have assumed that I just manufactured the noise in my head. But the fact that my sister heard it too makes me wonder what happened. I suppose someone could have come in our house and then left, but our doors were locked. Maybe they picked the lock, but I have no clue why someone would pick a lock, wander in for seconds, and then leave. The other thing is that we heard the footsteps enter but never leave. 7. I've had a few experiences that I can't really explain, but this one sticks out the most for me. It was when my son was still a baby, about 18 or 19 years ago, so the details are a bit hazy but I'll try my best to tell the story. My son had stayed over at my mom's on a Saturday night so we could have a rare night out, so on the Sunday morning around 10 a.m. I went to pick him up. I stopped at the supermarket on the way there to pick up a few bits and bobs. On the way to her road, you walk over an old railway crossing. There hasn't been a working railway line in the town since the 60s or 70s, but the crossing is still there. The tracks on either side were at the time rather abandoned and overgrown, and people used to use them to walk dogs and probably do drugs, etc. Anyway, as it was a Sunday morning, there weren't many people around, but as I walked over the railway crossing, a young boy, maybe 8 or 9 years old, suddenly appeared from the tracks and started talking to me. To be honest, I didn't take much notice at first as I was hungover, but he spoke in a really old-fashioned way and called me miss. He started asking me about the railway line and when it has closed down and why. I told him I wasn't sure, but that the old station was now a museum, so why didn't he go there to find out? He walked along with me asking more questions about the railway that I couldn't answer. We got to the car park at the top of my mum's road, which only took a few seconds, but felt like longer. I stopped walking there, as he was starting to annoy me and I didn't want him following me to my mum's. This was the first time I got a proper look at him since we'd been walking side by side, and I hadn't really had chance to get a good look at him until then. The only way I can describe how he was dressed was like a really old-fashioned school kid, short trousers and long gray socks, cap, and blazer. His way of talking was just really old-fashioned and creepy somehow, and he also didn't speak with a local accent. I can't place what accent he had anymore. I said, well, I'd better rush off now, but he pointed at my Sainsbury's plastic shopping bags and said, "What's that?" As if he had never seen a plastic bag before. I muttered that I had just been shopping and said, well, nice talking to you, bye, and just rushed away from the creepy little fucker. I walked the long way around the block in case he followed me, and I didn't look back. As I walked away, I heard him quietly sigh, "Bye then, miss and quat." I got to my mum's and said I'd just met the creepiest little boy. Mum thought I was just hungover and exaggerating things in my mind. I soon forgot about it. We didn't have internet at the time to Google it, and with a little kid to look after, I didn't have time to dwell on it. A few years later they started running ghost tours in my town and I decided to go along on one for a laugh. One of the stories was about how a Sunday school from Manchester had been on a train excursion to North Wales in 1897 and had been on the way home when the train came off the rails a few miles away from my town and several had been killed, both adults and children. Maybe I'm reading too much into it and he really was just a creepy, annoying kid, but I can't get the thought of this little ghost lad losing his life in a train crash after a fun day out at the seaside 125 years ago, and walking the tracks confused and scared and trying to get home to his mummy ever since. I wish I'd been nicer to him. 8. Both of my parents had passed away, my dad quite recent to the time this happened, and I really wanted a sign that he was still around and quat. One night I laid in bed, closed my eyes, and asked for a sign from him that would be clear and unmistakable. The next day, I took the kids to school and drove home with my second son, who was unwell. As we pulled into the driveway, we heard our burglar alarm going off. My first thought was it had been accidentally activated, so I ran into the house to switch it off with the keypad. Despite entering the code number several times, the ringing continued. So I removed the plug that powered it. Still ringing. I called the company and they explained how to turn it off from its main power source. The ringing didn't stop. The lady on the phone said she'd send an alarm engineer over, and I sat outside in our van. Suddenly, I remembered what I had said before I fell asleep and, to myself, said something like, "Dad, is that you?" and quat. The ringing stopped. Before long, the expert arrived and checked the alarm. No problems. He asked where the sound came from and I said the kitchen ceiling. He says, "That's odd, that's not where you should hear the alarm." And quat. So I asked him to let me hear what the alarm sounded like. It was a totally different sound to what I had heard. I am convinced it was my dad. 9. I was vacationing in the Philippines a little while ago, visiting family. The hotel room that I, my 2 sisters, and my cousin shared only had a king-sized bed, so I slept on the floor on a mattress, beneath a window. The room was on the ground floor and the window opened up to a forested walkway between rooms. I woke up while it was still dark and looked up at the nightstand to check the time. It was 3 a.m. Then suddenly, outside the window, I heard what sounded like children laughing and playing. My first thought was, who the hell is letting their kids play outside at 3 a.m.? There were plenty of foreigners staying at the resort, so I figured they must have been jet-lagged. But a little voice in my head told me, those aren't the voices of children and quat. As I considered the thought, a presence washed over me from under the bed. It was like a crushing weight, a lot like sleep paralysis. But it was the first time I ever experienced it, so I didn't think it at the time. Terrified, I prayed for what felt like 5 minutes, until the weight went away. Then I waited for sunrise to fall back asleep. I could call it sleep paralysis, but it was different in that I wasn't paralyzed as I woke up or fell asleep like the subsequent times I experienced the sensation. I woke up, sat up, looked around, then experienced it. But it could just have been some other similar physical issue plus an auditory hallucination for whatever reason. I spoke to my mom about it in the morning. She said something odd had also happened to her that night. She was visited by people she knew that had already passed away. There's something about the old country, she told me. Some sort of spiritual heaviness. 10. This happened when I was on camp at primary school, in either 2003 or 2004. I was about 12 or 13 years old at the time. We were playing the game Spotlight, which you can only play at night in a huge forest-type area on the campsite. Spotlight is basically like hide and seek, where one player is designated the seeker and is given a flashlight, and the rest of the kids get 30 to 40 seconds to hide somewhere in the dark. Then the seeker goes out to find the kids and uses the flashlight to seek them out. Whoever gets spotted has to join the seeker to help find the others. Anyway, I was chosen as the seeker and I was waiting at the entrance to the forest with my back turned while all the kids ran into various areas in the forest to hide. There were a lot of thick trees and dense bushes and shrubbery, so it was a perfect spot to hide for this particular game. By the end of the 40 seconds, it was dead silent, no movement, nothing. Liking a challenge, I headed into the forest to start my seeking, waiting for the sound of a rustle, any chatter, laughter or footsteps to give away someone's location. Again, there was just silence. It felt eerie, but forests do at night, I reasoned, so I kept shining my flashlight in different places that were big enough to hide a person. Suddenly the beam of light picked up on a shadow hiding in this old hut type thing. Excited I found someone, I flashed my light into the hut, ready to yell that I had caught them when inexplicably the flashlight just died. Without a light, this game was pointless, so I figured I would have to run back to camp and ask the supervising teacher for new batteries. Then the light began to flicker back on again, and I saw the same shadow begin to creep from the hut, so I quickly redirected the flashlight back onto my quarry. Then it flickered off again. I was about to shout out to the others that the game was on pause, when I felt something hard knock into me and a breathy voice said in my ear, "You caught me." And quat. I jumped backwards in fright so hard that I stumbled backwards, fell down. I screamed bloody murder as I sprinted all the way back to camp like an Olympian being chased by fire ants. The rest of my class were already back at camp, confused at where I'd been all that time, thinking I was pulling a prank on them. Turns out I had been gone over 15 minutes when it honestly felt like only a few moments, albeit very frightening moments, and the kids gave up and went back to camp. I told them I thought they were doing the same thing to me and demanded to know who was hiding in the hut. I didn't want to confess that they scared the living crap out of me because I was trying to act cool and brave. But I was really shaken. All the kids were accounted for, so whoever creeped up on me had to have run extremely fast to get back before me. It didn't make any sense. The kids seemed genuinely baffled and disappointed that the game ended dismally, so I believed them. In the end, to save face, I just laughed it off. But when the kids suggested playing again, I bailed out, saying I didn't feel like it anymore. Of course I was scared as hell, but didn't want to admit it. The kids ended up playing without me and they didn't report anything strange except that one of the kids thought they spotted more than one person in a dense hedge, but when they shined the flashlight there was only one kid in there. The kid hiding swore someone else was in the hedge with them, as they felt someone brush against them and felt someone breathing next to them. Very unsettling to say the least. It confirmed that what I experienced wasn't an isolated incident, and more chillingly, that it wasn't a prank. Also, the flashlight kept cutting on and off during their game too, but there was no issues with it at all for the rest of the time at camp. I still get shivers thinking about that game and the lack of rational explanation. 11. The time my mattress started shaking and there was no one else in the room who could have done it. 12. This happened when I was 12 years old. I remember waking up for school, taking a shower, and going to the kitchen to make some sandwiches for breakfast. As I was reaching for the bread, I felt like someone or something was behind me. As I turned around, I immediately saw a short, pale, black-eyed man whose head was bald on top with long black hair on the sides. He had a very angry look on his face and was charging at me with some long object, like a bat or plank, which he swung at my head. He actually hit me with it, but I didn't flinch because it happened so fast and I didn't have time to process it all. Luckily I only felt a light ding on my head. After that, I sort of regained my senses and the man was gone. I felt fine and continued with my day, feeling disturbed by the event. 13. I was using the bathroom and I heard 3 slow notes on my electric keyboard in the next room over. But all the windows were shut, my keyboard was unplugged and in a completely different room downstairs, and both cats were asleep on the bed. We couldn't figure out what it was, and freaked us out. A few weeks later, the same thing happened to my husband. He searched around looking for answers, but never figured out what it was. So far it hasn't happened again, but it gives me goosebumps thinking about it. 14. As a child, I would often hear a piano being played while I was trying to sleep. We didn't even have a piano. I'd tell my parents, but they'd brush it off and tell me it was just a dream. This went on for a few years as a child. It wasn't until I was an adult that my parents told me there used to be a piano in that room before we bought the house. 15. Using a Ouija board with 2 friends in my parents' house that was built in 1845. Pretty intense seance that got scary crazy when the entire board physically slid off our knees onto the knees of the person sitting next to me. 3 times. It got stranger a few minutes later. There had been a previous sighting of a shadow-like figure in a certain corner of the room where we had the seance. The woman working the Ouija board with me turned to look toward that particular spot in the corner. Without a word, she got up and walked into an adjacent room. I followed her and asked, "Do you see what I think you are seeing?" She replied, "Yes, he is standing right next to you." And quote. We noped out just about then. 16. I would see ghosts as a baby. I only know this story secondhand, but as a baby, I used to stare or point at certain spots. The only reason my parents knew I was looking at a certain space and not just staring off into the distance was because I'd follow it with my head when they moved me. Being highly religious at the time, they were like, "Yeah, he's seeing ghosts." And quote. It was only ever around the house and not malicious at all, so they stopped caring after a while. One time they needed a sitter and got my aunt to do it. She heard stories and such about the ghosts already, and was not super happy about the idea. Every few minutes, she would come and check on what I was doing around the house, and eventually she found me standing outside a dark room, pointing into it. She immediately screams, booked it to another room and locks herself in, leaving me behind with the ghost. She called my mom, who eventually got her to leave the room and check on me again, only to see that I was gone. Of course, I just went to go play somewhere else, but she immediately assumed that the ghost took me. She managed to not find me for about 10 minutes before I, completely oblivious, asked what was for dinner that day. 17. When I was a kid, I saw what I can only describe as a guy outside my bedroom window. That window is high in the air and you can't really stand there, and remembering the distance and angle I saw him from as I was lying down in my cot, I almost remember him sort of closer than the window itself, like he was coming through the closed window pane while standing upright and not moving. He had a super stern, icy, militant look on his face, almost like Peter Cushing/Tarkin in Star Wars, staring at me almost like he was angry. The weird part was, being a toddler, I wasn't even afraid at first. Not until he didn't reply when I said hi. 18. My family didn't have much money when I was a kid. We had a home, but my sister and I slept in the living room because of the lack of bedrooms. One night, the old-fashioned clunky type metal radiator started playing the Take Me Out to the Ball Game melody in what sounded like an old-fashioned player piano. It wasn't from outside or from another room. It sounds funny written out, but was very creepy to experience. We ran to our parents' room to sleep. That only happened once.